So let's jump into the audio effects for the next section here. The first one, and probably the most important in terms of ones that you like to be using on all your tracks instead of just kind of like experimenting with to begin with, is the equalizer. And the EQ up here with the thumbnail is the fastest way to access that. You can either click the thumbnail or go to Audio Effects, go down to EQ, and open Channel EQ in stereo. That's the same thing as kind of hitting the thumbnail. Opens the same window. And then this is kind of a frequency manager and analyzer. So it kind of takes signal from whatever track you put it on. But we don't really need signal to show you this part. I'm just kind of explain what all these kind of shapes and colors mean. So each one of these is a shape and how it lets you modify the frequency. That was a terrible way to put it. Basically, the low cut is how to cut the lows out of your frequency range. The low shelf is how to modify the entire low end of your frequency range. The bells are all meant to be a very specific shape in between kind of the lows and the highs for you to either boost or cut certain frequencies in decibels. So this also works in decibels. And then the high cut and the high shelf here are the other two parameters that you can use to cut down or trim out frequencies within the selected range. So humans can perceive, let's say, anywhere from 20 to 20,000 hertz. Hertz being like the frequency of the note and stuff like that. So each of these bells you can modify where the frequency actually is, which frequency you're adjusting, that is. The gain, which is the plus or minus how many dB you're actually affecting it, and then the last one being the Q factor. And the Q factor is basically how wide or thin you want that individual adjustment to be, whether you want it to be broad or whether you want it to be precise. And now that this bell is active, I'm adjusting 210 hertz up 6 decibels at a Q factor of 4. And this is a parametric EQ, which gives you those three options, as opposed to a graphic EQ, which is basically a bunch of bands that have individual frequencies that you turn up or down at a very specific Q factor, which is usually, written into the device, and you can't change that. So the flexibility of a parametric EQ is that you could change the Q factor. You could change individual frequencies in between frequencies. You could even type in, 119.5, and it won't give you that. It'll give you 120. But you get the point. You can get very specific with this. And the graphic EQ, you can only target specific bands that aren't changeable. Anyways, I'm going to give you a test oscillator here just to generate a sound, and forgive me, it's going to be a little loud at first. Cool. So now, basically, I'm just going to sweep from the bottom up at 20 hertz. And if I didn't mention this before, your audio effects, they go in series downwards, as opposed to like parallel, if you will. I think I covered this in the last section, but if you open the first plugin, all that signal, once it gets modified out of the output, is going to feed into the second plugin and then all the way down the line. So I'm going to switch the locations of these because I want the oscillator to go through the channel EQ. That's downwards, one feeds the other. So anyways, I'm going to start turning this up. And you'll see in my EQ curve, actually, it's generating, 20 hertz sine wave. And we're not going to be able to hear it. At least no one here is, unless you're listening on some crazy PA system. But as I raise the frequency, it should start to kind of rumble in your ears. So now we're at 90 hertz here. And now if I wanted to boost that in the EQ, it's going to get louder. If I want to buff that or cut it down, it's going to get softer. And the thinner, the more precise my Q factor is, the more it'll target a very specific frequency. So let's keep moving up the chain here. At 200 hertz, same thing. Boost, cut, do whatever you want to do. Now, I'm just mute this channel for a sec because that can get super annoying. we're all not all of us, but most of us are recording in what's called A440, which is, A1 on your piano is at 440 hertz. So what if I just go over to 440 here, leave that where it is. I'm going to open up at a software instrument. Let's choose a piano. Excuse me. Piano. Bring up the keyboard, and I'll actually play A440 for you. Now let's unmute a lot of windows here. Unmute our audio. Open up the keyboard again. Those should be the same note, basically, if I did my math correctly and I was in the right register or whatever. But 440 being A, that's like how you kind of connect the notes you're playing on the piano to the frequency they're actually registering in. And if you want, there's a whole bunch of materials kind of online of what note you're playing and where the root is, where the harmonics are, if it has overtones, when you play a chord, kind of what happens there in terms of frequency. But this is kind of the base knowledge, which is everything that makes noise exists within a frequency range, and for you to be able to modify that frequency is incredibly powerful. So keep it in mind, and we're going to move on to something that's not a test tone, but it's actually a real-life example. So this disco trance synth that I alluded to earlier, it sounds like this. Makes me want to go goblin mode. Anyways, I put the channel EQ on here, the disco trance synth itself. First thing I'm going to do, turn on the low cut and the high cut. Now I'll keep my analyzer on pre because I just want to see what the track is what it's making. Pre is all the signal that's coming in before you make changes. Post is all the signal that's coming in after you make, or coming out basically after you make changes. So on pre, this is what it looks like. Notice these kind of little spikes here in the low mids, anywhere from like 80 to 300 hertz. Those are like the root note of whatever note this person is playing. And all of these kind of extra peripheral stuff that kind of tapers off towards the high end, those are like the overtones. It's like the timbre of the instrument that's like kind of coming through. It's not the original register. It's like kind of the aftermath, if you will. So when you start to kind of play around with the bell curves and stuff on the EQ, you could highlight or buff or modify kind of individual frequency ranges, and you could completely kind of alter the timbre of the sound. Kind of give this like nice rising sweeping effect. It's kind of mimics what a phaser does, where it like sweeps in and out of an EQ range, or like a flanger, if you will. I don't know if you kind of knows what the terms are yet, but kind of sounds like like when you put your mouth over like an iPhone speaker. That's basically what this is doing. It's modifying how the sound waves like kind of depressurize through the EQ space, if you will. So up or down, left or right, and then thin or thick. That's the bell curves that you have access to with the parametric EQ. I think that's all I'm going to show you with the EQ for now. There's a couple of different options here. There's like a linear phase EQ. There's a single band. I'm sure there's some sort of graphic EQ if you wanted to download that, see what it looked like. But graphic EQ is really more for like frequency, like feedback management and prevention and stuff in like a live context. So parametric EQ is just kind of more of a flexible tool, which is why they gave you that. Cool. That's EQ. Last thing I want to cover in EQ before we move on, because it is kind of important. Let's go back to our oscillator for a minute. It's so loud, I hate it. There's also another option here for generator. It's called white noise, and white noise is basically an even distribution of gain across every frequency in the entire spectrum. And it's going to sound like it's really high end and like fizzly and loud. And that's because your brain perceives higher frequencies as louder, even though they're not. It's the same exact level across the whole spectrum. But let me just turn it up and you'll see what I mean. Kind of sounds like TV static, you know? But if I were to open the EQ for this, nothing happens because am I lost? Oh, there it is. Yeah, so I'm not gonna, I'll do this. Great, that's better. So now this is what white noise looks like across the EQ spectrum. If I change it to pink noise, it kind of focuses more on the low end because it's like the same decibel across multiple octaves, I think is how pink noise works. I'm going to have to double check my research on that. And then a square wave, they're a lot sharper. So if I lower a square wave here, it's going to have a bunch of overtones. Overtones being not the original note, but then the extra spikes of harmonics that happened above it. So notice the difference between a sine wave and a square wave in terms of overtones. Ready? And then a needle pulse, which I've never clicked this button, so let's find out what it does. That just sucks. Okay, we're not going to use the needle pulse because I'm guessing it's some sort of other kind of wave generator that, you know, helps you do frequency management and whatnot. So no more of that. Okay, moving on to compression. All right, so compression, another kind of very controversial topic in the music industry. Compression, basically a broad overview of compression is basically just takes your signal and it's don't even get me started. It modifies the highest most peak and the lowest most trough, if you will, it modifies it so that it is in a more compressed format so that you could make changes after it to bring it up kind of as a unit. And if you have a particularly dynamic signal, like if someone's playing a drum kit, there's a bunch of loud crashes and like soft deliveries that they might be playing. You want to kind of have that be a uniform structure so that you can bring it up or down as a whole and it doesn't get too loud and it doesn't stay too soft. So drums is the best example I can think of compression on because it's the most dynamic instrument. But say we had, you know, this synth. Actually, I'm going to load in a drum track because that would be the best way to attack this. Great. You're mine now. I missed here, so there it is. I'm going to press Command R here to repeat it. By the way, if I were to change the timing here and I trim it down a little bit and I press Command R again, it's going to loop at the end of the region, basically, this being the region and this being the loop. And if I loop it again, it's going to end at a different region. So we're not necessarily in time anymore. It's because I'm looping a smaller region. But anyways, going to loop this to match the cycle that we're actually working in. I'm going to play this and open the compressor. Two different ways to open the compressor. Go to Audio Effects, Dynamics, Compressor up here, or you can click the little thumbnail right above the EQ. That's a little bar down here, and it shows you your gain reduction meter. So once we have this active, this is the track that we're playing. Oh, I can't help but just groove. And this reduction meter is how much it's actually taking down every time something happens. So the input is how much signal we're getting in. The output is how much signal is coming out of the plugin. And don't let this window kind of overwhelm you because there's a lot of different options here to choose from. I'm going to go over the necessary parameters in here. The first one is the threshold. So if we have this track playing, it's coming in at about -9, -8. So I'm going to set my threshold to everything that I want to adjust. All of the signal that you want it to modify, you'll lower the threshold so it meets that amount of signal. So up to -8 here, nothing's going to happen in the reduction meter. Maybe a tiny bit will. And the more I lower my threshold, the more signal comes into the compressor that actually gets modified. I don't know if you can kind of hear it. By this point, I'm modifying most of the signal that's coming in, which is why the reduction meter is going crazy. There's a VU meter, by the way, is what it's called. So I'm going to choose an appropriate threshold of how much signal I actually want to modify, and that depends on how much signal you're actually getting into the compressor. So if I opened it on this one, this being my Disco Trance synth now, I'm going to unmute it, mute the kit. Now we're at -13, -14 dB worth of signal. So this compressor threshold is going to be different than the drum beat because we're getting a different amount of signal. So it's a very malleable tool that you have to use based off the specific track that you want to be modifying. So I'm going to mute that, put this away, open up my drum kit again, unmute, and now here's the threshold that we're working with. This one. The second one is the ratio, the more important parameter. Once you decide on a threshold of how much sound you want to actually modify, the ratio is how aggressive it attacks the top end of the decibel range of the signal. So the higher the ratio, the more it kind of plateaus and curves off. And the better example is the graph of how to show you how much signal it's actually modifying. So the threshold will catch more signal, and the ratio will compress it harder. And you see that kind of plateauing here as I up the ratio. It's taking every, if it's at 101, it's taking every 1 decibel and converting it to 1 decibel. If it's at 201, it's going to take every 2 decibels and change it to 1 decibel. If I'm at 501, it's going to change every 5 decibels to make it 1 decibel. So you kind of see what we're after here. It's squashing it harder and harder once it gets above the threshold. So a softer ratio will do less work, and a harsher ratio will do more work. A lower threshold will gather more signal to work on, and a higher threshold will gather less signal to compress. So those being the two most important parameters in the compressor. Then you have the makeup gain. And the makeup gain is basically how much juice you want to give it after the ratio has taken place. So if I decide on a specific threshold and ratio for the drum kit, and I lower the makeup gain, now the entire signal post-compression is either going to be down 5 decibels or up 10 decibels, or whatever you want it to be, basically. Makeup gain and output gain in this circumstance are the exact same. They're just going to take the signal after the compression takes place and modify how loud it is. The attack and the release are pretty important too. The attack is basically how long it takes for the ratio to take effect. If you have a faster attack, it'll get everything right on the dot. And if you have a lower effect, it'll kind of wait that amount of time to start compressing the signal. Same with release. Once it leaves the threshold, how long it takes for the compressor to stop affecting it. And if it's faster, it'll go away really quick. And if it's lower, it'll take longer to kind of taper off. So I'm going to just play this and mess around with the parameters, and you can see which actually each one of them are affecting. Knee, I'll just go over because it's in the digital, which is the Platinum Digital is the default version that it actually opens up, which shows you this knee curve. But if I went to a VCA plugin or a FET plugin, any of these kind of other emulations, if you will, the knee is not an option, and the attack and the ratio are actually not an option for some of these. These are all emulating kind of hardware compressors, is what it's after here. So sticking with Platinum Digital, if I lower the knee, it'll kind of make that threshold sharper, and if I raise the knee, it'll make it softer. So I'm just going to start playing around, and if you hear it, props, kudos. It's kind of a tough thing to hear. But the VU meter and the graph are kind of both tools to help you analyze what you're actually modifying within the compressor. So let's have at it. So this last one that I'm modifying is the mix, which is the dry or the wet, or the input versus the output signal. So if you have it all the way over on input, you're not going to hear any changes that the compressor is making. And if you have it all the way over on output, you're hearing every change that the compressor is making. And somewhere in the middle is basically a mix between those two, mix between the dry and the wet. So at 0%, this is what it sounds like. And at 100%, this is what it sounds like. So use this kind of once you're done with your compressor parameters to adjust how much the compressor is actually affecting the signal on your track. Post compressor, how much you're actually hearing the changes you made, basically. And if it is distorting, you have an option to either soft clip, hard clip, or full clip. And that provides for some kind of really nice percussive texture. For if you are clipping, it decides what timbre the distortion is, which may be an effect that you desire. And then the limiter, which is basically like a brick wall ceiling of like nothing will go above this decibel. So if it's at 0, if you get up to 0, you're probably hearing distortion because 0 unity is where it starts to clip. But as you lower that, let's just see what happens. So now nothing is coming above -6, no matter how much I push the gain, no matter how high the ratio I choose, no matter how much makeup gain I do, it'll never go above -6 if the limiter's on and that's the decibel you chose.